Hey everybody, welcome to this URBC session on getting beyond death dollars and downtime. We're super excited to have the panel convened here today for what I think is going to be a really exciting conversation. My name is Maurice Renee, and on behalf of the URBC Organizing Committee, I'm really happy to be your host for today. I am very grateful to be speaking to you from Sea to Sky Landscape, traditional territories of the Squamish Nation, and it gives me an opportunity to reflect on what it means to be on a landscape that's exposed to some of the greatest hazards in Canada, and how the communities have lived with those hazards here over centuries. We are really thrilled to have this panel together for our conversation today, and I'm going to let our moderator, Micah Hilt, introduce each of the speakers in more detail. But this is a conversation that we've touched on in previous sessions, and one that we're going to dig into in some depth here. Before we get started, I just want to give a grateful acknowledgement to our sponsors for this URBC session, without whom we wouldn't be able to put this session on. This year, Natural Resources Canada and the Canadian Safety and Security Program have put up funding for sponsorship. We also have generous support from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the Office of Housing and Construction Standards here in BC, Bruce Geotechnical Consulting, EERI, who is co-hosting this session, the BC Real Estate Association, and Engineers and Geoscientists BC. So we're super thankful for their contributions and support. We are really trying to promote these conversations. So this is our URBC hashtag, and please shout it out to your social networks as we go along, either for this session or for upcoming sessions. The Understanding Risk Symposium is really an experiment in how we might go about implementing the Sendai framework here at a regional scale. And so sessions really focus on these three elements of implementing Sendai at a regional scale. It's first, of course, understanding the risk. And we have a number of sessions that are just focusing on risk assessment and recovery modeling. We have sessions like today that are focusing more on using that information to inform choices. And we have sessions that are going to focus on the governance piece. And you can see how these sessions where we are here today, Death Dollars and Downtime, is kind of punctuating this conversation for us. So we're super excited. With that, I am really pleased to pass the baton over to Micah Hilt, who will be your very able and animated moderator for our conversation today. And I really want to encourage everyone, before I pass the baton over to Micah, to really lean in and share your thoughts and questions with the panelists, and help kind of keep this conversation going today. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass it over to Micah.
Hi there, everyone. Welcome to our session. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a lot of people and already active conversation going on in the chat. So it promises to be a very lively conversation, which is awesome. It's a super important topic. So I'm going to introduce the concept first, and what it is we hope that you'll get out of this session, and then we'll have a couple polling questions, and then after that, I'll introduce each of the panelists. They'll give a presentation, and then I'll be asking them questions, and then there'll be an opportunity using the question and answer function to ask us questions and vote them up and down, all of that. You want to ask your questions ideally in the question and answer function so that you can vote them up and down, I think is the deal. So with that, so today's session is called Beyond Death, Dollars, and Downtime, Exploring Functional Recovery in BC. I'll leave it to David to define functional recovery, and I'll leave it to the rest of the panelists to really help us define that here in BC and think about the concept more broadly. But the imperative behind this is to really think how we can get better performance out of our buildings, how we can get better performance out of our communities following a disaster. Obviously, disasters are in the front of our minds with this group. They're in the front of the minds of everybody in this year, particularly as we're in the midst of 1 to 2 to 3 of them, depending on what day it is. So this standard, this functional recovery standard, it's a way of thinking through buildings. It's a way of thinking through the concept of resilience and what that means at the building scale, the community scale, and helps us think about what it is that we're actually able to get out of our buildings. So what we're hoping that people will get out of this session today is understand what functional recovery is versus what is provided in the code currently, or maybe that is something that's in the code. We'll get to that with the polling questions. Understand what we're doing here in BC in terms of our building performance, in terms of functional recovery standard, yes or no on that. And it helps us to think about what we should be doing differently, how we can think about community resilience. Question number 1, there's going to be a quiz, and here it is. If there's a significant earthquake or flood during this session, that would suck. I'm in a non-ductile concrete building in the West End. How long before the building you are now sitting in will be generally back to normal in terms of services to tenants and users? Within minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, just enough time to exit safely, never going back in again, or no expectation of getting back in, or you don't know. So a majority of the folks don't know, which is great. Well, we can talk about that. Next largest within a few weeks, a reasonable expectation, within a few months, and then just enough time to exit safely. No one said within minutes, so that's good. Within hours, a few days. Okay, so keep this question in mind when we're thinking about some of the presentations and the conversation today. Okay, so next question. Which of the following is the most responsible for keeping us from designing new buildings and infrastructure for faster recovery and restoration of service after a major hazard? Developers, costs exceeds long-term benefits, infrastructure won't support better buildings, so why bother? Architects, engineers, and builders lack the awareness. Lack of market demand, so the clients are just not asking for this. If it weren't important, the government would require it. I like that one. And don't know. Who's to blame? What does the building code, so to that point, what does the building code design to? Life safety, safe failure, continuous occupancy or reoccupancy, post-event functionality, or shelter in place. Where does our current building code here in British Columbia, not in California, not wherever, here in British Columbia, what does our code currently design to? So the idea is to think why we don't do this, which is sort of a leading question considering what we're talking about today, but why we don't get to this higher standard. And then what is our current standard? Okay, so majority or most people said that there's a lack of demand, and most people believe that it our current code performs to life safety. I'm not going to tell you any right answers. That's not, I'm here to facilitate a conversation. So we'll get into the right answers as soon as we get to our panelists. Okay, so keeping in mind, panelists, lack of market demand, initial costs exceed the benefits. Those are the two leading examples. A bunch of people don't know, which is totally fine. And then the leading answer, 81% for what is our current building code designed to, is life safety. Thank you to the engineers in the crowd for the strong showing on the correct answer for that one. Okay, there's a lot going on in the chat that I can't deal with right now, but we'll get to. Okay, so format for this, I'm going to introduce the presenters. They're going to present, and then I have questions for them, and you'll have questions for them, and that'll happen after. So here we go. Okay, so we have 4 experts, 2 local and 2 that are coming to us from California. David Bonowitz is a structural engineer practicing in San Francisco and is this year's EERI Distinguished Lecturer. The title of his lecture being Functional Recovery, What It Means to Design for Community Resilience. So that's David. Angie Wu, who is the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Lead for Fraser Health, Providence Healthcare, Providence Health Services Authority, and Vancouver Coastal Health. She works for a lot of people and works to normalize the use of climate hazard risk information and leverage collective practices to break the chain of cascading impacts on the broader health system and those it serves. We also have John Sherstobitoff, structural engineer with over 30 years of experience in seismic design, and design of both buildings and infrastructure, not just buildings. Through a variety of leadership roles, he has championed new clauses in the recent codes related to resilience and functional recovery here in Canada. Most recently, a new section regarding higher performance, in quotes, requirements for new buildings in the national code. And then last up, we have Ibbi Almufti, who is an associate principal in Advanced Technology and Research Group in Arup in San Francisco, where he leads risk and resilience practice. His specializations include probabilistic risk analysis, performance-based design, nonlinear seismic analysis, and risk-based resilience advisory. He also worked on UBC's seismic assessment they did of all of their buildings as well. Great. So that's our panelists today. Panelist questions. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to present.
We're going to do this in real quick presentation. So hopefully, if you have any questions about something I've run through, we'll get it in the Q&A. I'm going to start with this image from the Christchurch earthquake in 2011. Now, 182 people died in this earthquake. So that's not a small number, depending on your perspective, but the vast majority of them died in the collapses of 2 buildings. Meanwhile, the city later had to tear down over 600 buildings. And you can see here that the central business district was shut down and cordoned off for 2.5 years. So if we're concerned about this performance at the city level, it's got to be about more than safety. So that's why the title of the slide here is Safety versus Resilience. How do we distinguish what we're talking about when we're talking about community resilience as being different from safety? So resilience has these 4 key ideas behind it, and we may come back to these. First, it's not an attribute of buildings. We don't talk about buildings as being resilient. We talk about organizations or social units as being resilient. Focused on function, not safety. So from a resilience perspective, it's just as important to be able to get back in as it is to get out. We're going to measure this resilience over time. That's a new metric for design that we haven't seen before. Because if you cordon off your downtown for 2 days, that's a lot different from cordoning it off for 2 months or for 2 years. It's not just a measure of the damage. And then finally, it's, at least for our conversation today, we're talking about natural hazards as something we're being resilient with respect to. So the question then is, how are we going to design for this? If we say, as I say here in the first bullet, that resilience is not an attribute of a building, but we design buildings, how can we be designing for resilience? That's the question, and we can begin to answer it with this rather complicated diagram, which we don't have time to go into, but you can see right away, resilience, again, different from safety. Safety is on that line, attributes of individual business. Safety, economy, reoccupancy, recovery, that's the same as deaths, dollars, downtime. So when we go beyond deaths, dollars, downtime, to refer back to the title of the session, we add organizational qualities, we can begin to get something like resilience, again, not an attribute of a building, but an attribute of the organization. So resilience is not just safety times 2, it's on a totally different line. And in fact, it's more related to reoccupancy and recovery. But the point we want to make here is that we follow our traditional design path. We're actually designing for safety. Everybody got that answer right. And what that means is it's going to be hard to reach resilience if that's all we do. If we want to get closer to designing for resilience, we got to be thinking more in our design about reoccupancy time and functional recovery time. So that leads us then to this question, even if we can't design for resilience, we can design for recovery, but there's a relationship there somehow, and that's going to represent the challenge. Think about the resilience field and work that you mean in the resilience area, particularly from folks like the Rockefeller Foundation, very important conceptual ideas about the community, very holistic, and so you see it down here on the bottom right of this chart. Meanwhile, when we do designs, we're still designing one building at a time on the left side of the chart. And it's very technical stuff, not very holistic. It's a building code. You know what those things look like. So we end up on the top left part of this chart. The challenge to us is to see, as we develop design standards and codes, can we do it so that when they're applied in the aggregate, we actually get some improvement in the holistic community-wide resilience? That's going to be the challenge to us in developing these new documents. But here we see that relationship between functional recovery as being more technical and about the individual building, as opposed to community resilience, which is the holistic idea we are shooting toward. So in a rough way, you see the title of the slide, functional recovery is to the building as community resilience is to the community. And that's both a distinction and a relationship that we want to make. So last year, EERI wrote this white paper talking about how we might develop this concept of functional recovery, identified 4 issue areas to think about. I refer you to the paper. You can find it rather quickly online. And here's 8 recommendations we're not going to go to. We may come back to this slide later that identifies things we can actually start doing now to design for a functional recovery. And they go from voluntary stuff that takes, that you can see down to national policies that have to be involve codes and standard development and a lot of research. But we can do some things now. So it's not a pipe dream. We here have 4 examples of buildings. 3 of them happen to be in San Francisco, where the designers voluntarily said, let's work with our clients to see if we can intentionally design for a faster recovery time or for a defined recovery time. Now, if we just do a few of these in a particular community, does that avoid the problem of Christchurch, to go back to my first slide? No, it doesn't. It's important, it's essential work to be doing this stuff now to show proof of concept and develop these ideas. But ultimately, I think we're finding we need some policy. That you can find more of this lecture online. Back to you, Micah.
All right. Next up, we have, and I believe there's a change of order, we have Angie.
Thanks, Micah. Good afternoon, everyone. Straight out of the gate, I will say that rather than regarding myself as a subject matter expert, I am in fact a generalist and a practitioner who works with many subject matter experts on very cool projects. Today, I will highlight just a handful of those projects to give a sense of our perspective and our process for improving resilience or building resilience across our health facilities portfolio. Here we have, Micah mentioned that I support for health organizations in the Lower Mainland. This graph, or this image focuses on just one, Fraser Health, and its service delivery area. We can see that in the past, the number of days over 25 degrees Celsius were fairly low. They were between 10 and 30 days per year. With the help of our climate scientist friends at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, PCIC, we understand that looking forward to the 2080s, we can expect 3.5 times more days above 25 degrees Celsius, 6 times more days above 30 Celsius, 20 times more nights above 20 degrees Celsius. And what that boils down to for people who design and build buildings is an increase in cooling demand days by nearly 6 times. When we consider that we build our critical infrastructure, so our hospitals, which are indicated here in the large black circles, we build these to last for generations, and that means a minimum of 60 years. Given that nearly all of our current building stock is around 50 to 60 years old, we can expect their extended lives, their service lives to be extended by to 80, 100, and even 120 years. So as we plan and design new hospitals, which are defined as critical infrastructure, and long-term care facilities, we need to go beyond the stringent post-disaster requirements that already apply to in terms of system reliability, future capacity, and redundancy. We need to go beyond what we are required to do in order to plan and design for our new climate reality. This slide shows a subset of non-critical infrastructure. So these are home and community care, places where home and community care is carried out. Many of you will know that because of our current pandemic situation and likely future pandemic situation, services that the health authorities provide, including virtual health, have been accelerated and amplified. In other words, our hospitals are becoming more and more nodes in a network of health services and programs that we provide to our communities. And that means that we need to understand what is happening with our non-critical infrastructure, as well as how various hazards interact. So while we began understanding extremes in variability and unpredictability of single hazards, such as extreme heat and flood, we need to understand compounding hazards. So what does it mean when we have flood on top of heat in to our assets portfolio? And over that lifespan of 60 to 80, 120 years, what are the associated operational costs? So this is an online platform called XDI, Cross Dependency Initiative. It's part of a pilot project of the Climate Action Secretariat that is helping us to understand what to expect in terms of average annual losses. And this image in the upper right corner provides a quick snapshot of what we have to look forward to over time. So it looks out to 2050, 28, and 2100. And finally, moving from assets, so what we actually are responsible for, to infrastructure that's offsite or outside of our sphere of immediate control. We look to critical infrastructure such as transformers, substations, towers, and those who are responsible for that critical infrastructure to understand where are the gaps and weaknesses and strengths and opportunities, of course, within our network of critical infrastructure, and look forward to perhaps more dialogue on how we can share the responsibility for ensuring that the critical infrastructure we all depend on is resilient to our future, current and future climate change. So my final slide, I'd like to share some preliminary results from a project called Health Adapt, funded by Health Canada. And this is looking at our actual communities of care in terms of what is the exposure of people to high heat days and extreme heat. What is our sensitivity to, in this case, extreme heat, and what is their capacity to adapt? So some of those factors in adaptive capacity include, for higher temperatures, they include income and social status, education and literacy, physical environments, social supports and coping skills, race, racism, and existence of hazard response plans and guidelines. So in sum, we are now in an era where the department that I work for needs to look well beyond its sphere of control and move beyond its comfort zone, and to seek out these new collaborations with those, including in population and public health, so within our health system, in emergency management, in disease monitoring and surveillance, to better understand those we serve, as well as our broader community of professional services firms. So those are the engineers and the architects and academic researchers, as well as academic researchers, to modify our existing tools and processes and to develop new ones. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you, Angie. I was actually just taking some notes from that. There's a lot of really helpful things that came out of that. Okay, up next, we have John. I'm going to hand it over to you, John, to go ahead and present.
My topic is on building codes and structural design for earthquakes, moving towards improved performance for new buildings and how this can contribute to community resilience. Just a little step back, I think we're all aware codes provide minimum legal requirements. Any owner is free to build to more than the minimum. Here in BC, of course, we design for 3 different potential earthquakes. The key thing about our code, though, is we're only designing for one level of earthquake today, this rare, severe earthquake 2% and 50-year probability of exceedance, or this annual exceedance probability of 1 in 2475. We have data on 3 other lower levels of earthquakes. So again, we have the ability to set performance points for those, which we're not doing right now. Okay, so codes. Performance or contribution to resilience is really, it's implicit in current codes. It's not explicit, but it is there. And codes use importance factors and drift limits for different building types to provide this improved performance. And I think we're all aware there's an increased importance factors for different types of buildings, and there's reduced drift limits. So again, the higher the importance factor, the lower the drift, the lower the amount of damage for this 2% and 50 earthquake. Some studies suggest that if you can keep the drifts to less than 0.5%, this results in very minor damage to the OFCs, or the non-structural components, and we'll come back to that later. So there's a lot of these cartoons on sort of this continuum of performance. I just want to say, here's our IE of 1, the normal buildings by the current code, 2%, 2.5% drift. And the reason I'm showing this continuum, because in the code, we've got over 40 different structural systems that are acceptable to design to meet this criteria. And the performance of each one of them is different, but it's definitely going to be better than collapse prevention, and it's going to achieve life safety. Again, for the next level of buildings, of the high importance ones, the bar moves to the left. So we're getting better performance as we move down, and reduce drift. As we move to the post-disaster building, the bar moves to the left. And again, the beauty here is we've only got about 20 structural systems that can be used, so the variation becomes a bit better. Again, in the current code, we have provisions for design, base isolation, and dampers. That's brand new in the current code that we have. And the goal here, it states in the code that all structural components shall remain elastic for the 1 in 2475 earthquake. So for these, the bar is over here right now. What can we do? Again, right now we can take conventional design and we can get to this point. Again, base isolation, dampers there, we can get to this point. Based on the studies that I've been involved in, this is 1 to 5% of the total building cost as the incremental cost to get here. And again, as structural engineers, we can design every building to get here, but this is something to keep in mind. So what's coming up? The next National Building Code, NBC 2020, to be released in 2021. And again, we propose to raise the bar for performance on certain types of buildings. Post-disaster buildings, again, have to remain elastic, or considered undamaged for a 1 in 1,000 return period earthquake, with a reduced drift limit, that 0.5% limit I mentioned earlier. High importance building like schools, again, need to remain elastic, undamaged for a 1 in 475 earthquake with a reduced drift limit. And for normal buildings over 30 meters high, we've got some criteria that the non-lateral load resisting elements need to remain elastic. And this is to make sure that irregular buildings behave very well for this level of earthquakes. And again, this is just that same cartoon to represent it. So post-disaster building, this level of earthquake, this is the bar that they're expected to perform to, regardless of the 20 structural systems that are available. And similarly for high importance buildings, for this level of earthquake, this is the performance we expect, again, regardless of the structural system that can be chosen. So again, that's a quick intro. And again, hopefully with support from the audience over the next number of years, we can keep moving the bar for new buildings and higher performance in the codes. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, John.
Yeah, I have 3 slides. So I have 3 minutes to talk about some work we've been doing with the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. We've been working for UBC for about 5 years now. The first few years really was to help them understand their seismic risks on their campus to buildings and utilities. And in the past, I'd say about a year, we've been helping them develop a campus resilience framework, which starts with really trying to help them understand what the resilience objectives are, or the campus resilience vision is, aspirational visions. And you can see some of the work we've done here basically engaging with various stakeholders across campus to translate that into resilience metrics. And so the first metric there is a life safety goal, no fatalities in future earthquakes. That's aspirational. And underlying that or underpinning that is all buildings on campus are as safe or safer than intended by modern code provisions. And the second major objective is an operational recovery goal, where we'd like to restore campus operations within 3 months of a major earthquake. And here, a major earthquake means about a 475-year earthquake. And again, most buildings on campus to achieve that need to be designed or retrofitted to beyond code low damage provisions. And so we're developing for UBC what we call a roadmap to resilience that consists of a few different guidance documents. The first is what we call a seismic real estate framework that guides decision making. And that's underpinned by a couple different resilience-based design guidelines, one for new construction and one for retrofits and renewals. And then just digging a bit deeper on each of these, the real estate framework really defines tolerable risk targets for various building types on campus, and we've designated the buildings on campus as critical, important, or normal. We're trying to basically understand from the current risks, what are the gap, or what is the gap between the current risks and the resilience objectives that I showed on the first slide, and then how do we close that gap? So really this is trying to fill the decision making to get to a goal of those campus resilience vision by 2050 roughly. And so the real estate framework will basically identify the buildings over the next 30 years that should be retrofitted to a certain standard, and also what to design new buildings to, which levels of performance. And again, those are beyond code resilience objectives, really following the READY framework that some of you may be familiar with, which set out resilience objectives in terms of downtime and low damage. And then again, to implement the framework, we've developed, or we're developing, resilience-based design guidelines for new construction. Again, following the READY framework, but bespoke to UBC, the campus, and the Canadian context. And as part of that, we're developing a companion guidance for designing non-structural components to achieve functionality level performance. And then for retrofits and renewals, similarly, we're providing some guidance to ensure that those retrofits achieve not only life safety objectives, but in some cases, especially if they're designated critical or important buildings, resilience objectives that limit the amount of downtime in a 475-year earthquake.
So I have one question per panelist, and I'm going to go in order of the presentations. All right, David, first question. How do we take advantage of site-specific opportunities similar to 181 Fremont, which was on your slide, and Strathcona School, which John worked on, but also apply a more holistic neighborhood and regional scale with regards to implementing performance-based standards for buildings and infrastructure that support functional recovery?
We have these great examples of voluntary work that's being done now, but that's not enough to achieve any kind of a community level impact, right? So you can't avoid Christchurch by just having the top firms in your city design new buildings to be, by some functional recovery standard. And that's because resilience, unlike designing for safety, is a collective action problem. That's a term that's familiar maybe to economists, but it means that it's, as a collective action, any collective action problem requires a mandate to solve it. You can't just get it from enlightened self-interest from a few individuals, or else you run into something called the tragedy of the commons. So if we're thinking about resilience in the right way, I think it leads us to the understanding that we're eventually going to need to solve this as a collective action problem that needs a mandate. In the design and construction world, a mandate is represented by a building code. It says, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to just need everyone to do it. And what we have found is that people are not resistant to doing that. They are resistant to doing it if they're the only ones. So in fact, the community out there, the public, would like a mandate as long as it is reasonable, because that tells them that everybody else is doing it and they're not putting themselves at a disadvantage by sticking their necks out to be one of the pioneers or leaders. Not everybody can be a pioneer or a leader.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I wonder about the British Columbia context with that, because that makes sense to me in California, because there's been all this sort of seismic retrofitting action that's been taken. But in some ways, the leaders, if you will, the ones that step out and do it first, the pilots, they're completely alone in the context here to some extent. So I wonder if that changes the environment for that. I mean, yeah, it's just hard from a perspective to think about coming out with a mandate, when there's so little familiarity with what that looks like. There's so little demand. It's a bit of a chicken and the egg kind of thing I'm constructing here.
Sadly, what we know is that actually that's not different from the California experience. It's just that California has had more earthquakes, and it takes 2 or 3 before people finally realize we're going to need to do something about these unreinforced masonry buildings. In Iran, they had they talk about it as the first earthquake gets the attention of the researchers, the second gets the attention of the people, the third gets the attention of the government. So until you get to that point, it's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy. And in fact, we don't have to look just to California as a counterpoint to what you're seeing in BC. In Seattle and Portland, they tried to get URM, unreinforced masonry retrofit ordinances, in the last couple of years, and both of those failed. So we know that it's a challenge, and sometimes, sadly, what you need is a tragedy to get things happening. Hopefully, with good leadership, we avoid that.
Yeah. Okay. Angie was next. Okay. Fraser Health and Vancouver Coastal Health already have climate projection reports for design teams to use. Why isn't this data enough for planners and designers to ensure that health facilities are climate resilient? We know a lot, so why is that not enough to move action in that way?
In short, the maps that I showed in the beginning, we produced those 3 or 4 years ago, and with tables for each and every single one of our hospitals. And very obviously, naively, we expected that our design teams and the health authority staff would just know what to do with them. This, unfortunately, is not the case. It's one thing to provide data with information, but it's quite another to identify and optimize the very specific junctures in a planning and design process to utilize that data and information. And so fairly quickly, we had to pivot to better understand the planning and design process, which is very complicated and complex. It has many moving parts. It's a process that's both fast and slow. So it happens in spurts. And what that means, to be more specific, is we have very, very short specific opportunities for in planning and design, that if we miss them, we essentially miss the boat. And it is extremely challenging to then jump onto, to switch analogies, to then jump onto a moving train rather. So in short, if we need to we have found the key junctures in planning and design, and those are in the concept planning, in what we call site planning and facility planning. So in developing the process for developing concept plans and business plans for major health capital projects, which we have many different definitions and categories, but we broadly define them as any project, any asset or infrastructure valued at 2 million or over, because those projects require a business plan or a business case to be approved by the Ministry of Health and the Treasury Board. So therein lies an opportunity for an intervention that will actually have the impact that we intend and need it to have. So concept plan, business plan, as well as when we go into the facility planning process. So that means everything from developing our indicative designs to which then inform our project specifications or requirements to procurement, project procurement. So bringing on board the design teams that we feel confident are on the same page as us in terms of understanding and acting on the climate risks. Thanks.
It seems like there's some connections between your answer and David's answer a bit about because what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of challenge in the process to figure out how to work that in. There's a bit of data fluency issues, like getting people knowledgeable and comfortable with the data. Sure, that's fine. But even if that were to be the case, process is in some ways the enemy of product because it's not really configured to take in these sort of complex problems. And I can't help but think out loud that, a mandate would be helpful to guide process in such a way, but then you don't want to make projects unviable, particularly if they're serving vulnerable communities and things like that. I guess that's where my head, David, was coming at when I was thinking about balance, trying to balance those priorities and everything. Oh, that was a little off book, so I gotta get us back on schedule here. But I could not respond. Thank you, Angie. Okay, John. Which one do I want to ask you? Oh, as you were putting together the new Canada Building Code, did you do any benefit cost studies? If so, what did you find? If not, what was the working assumption about feasibility? I'm so glad that I asked that question.
No, thanks, Micah. Yeah, so one of the, and I'll get back to your question in just a second, but as you saw on that one slide, that from the studies we've done with a variety of clients recently, to move that bar, even for that 1 in 2475 level earthquake, a very severe earthquake, to move the bar where the structure can remain elastic or undamaged, depending if it's a large building or small building, isolated or conventional. We found it's in that 1 to 5% of the total building cost, not just the structural component. Now, at the Canadian Commission level, when we put in these proposals for NBC 2020, everyone needs a cost impact analysis. So we did a cost impact analysis for all new Part 3 buildings built in Canada in a year. What is the incremental cost of our provisions relative to the cost of all buildings in Canada? And it's far below 1% as an aggregate to Canada, in building cost in Canada. So these are the kind of numbers that the Commission looks at. And if you can keep that incremental cost on a national level to the cost of buildings in all of Canada, there's huge support for it. So that's why they support it. I think the committee that we're on, we don't want to wait until we have 2 or 3 earthquakes, as David suggested. We want, the world is moving towards improved performance, and that's why, between the committee and the Commission, small cost nationally, improved performance to a good increase in the bar, and they supported that. So yeah, we did do that cost backup.
I know that's the #1 question that I get is, well, how much more is this gonna cost? And then there's the debates over, what is too much, what is too little, then balancing between, well, do you really want to replace your building, or do you want to just spend, X% more now? You may not have X% more at all, or whatever. So that's a big thing right there.
Yeah, and Mike, I agree. That's the #1 question we get asked. And again, sophisticated clients are happy to pay to have operational the next day. And again, developers, which are a different marketplace, they have to be competitive with the market, and it's difficult to do more than just follow the code.
Ibbi, your work with UBC showcases how the work from risk assessment to resilience-based design guidelines, a real estate framework, and asset management and investment strategy. Can you comment on what the major success factors were in making this important transition from data and information and analysis to an actual framework for action. I'm a UBC student and I'm seeing these conversations occur in different departments. So it's actually moved into action. How did you do that? Especially with UBC of all places.
I would say it's because of them, really. You know, they listen. They're an educated client or an organization. They have a lot to lose. You know, if there was an earthquake that was to hit Vancouver, it's an existential threat to their core mission, which is teaching and research. And so they, you know, they as many clients do, they will listen and kind of be educated about, let's say, the differences between, let's say, a code-based life safety goal and a recovery or resilience objectives, and that really for them kind of resonated. I would say, you know, UBC has been doing seismic risk assessments for decades. I think when we came on board back in 2015, there was they wanted to kind of refresh that. The look at the life safety issues in particular on campus, but one of the main players there, VP of Finance, if I recall correctly, had lived through the New Zealand experience with the earthquakes there while he was at university, or I don't know what his function was, maybe he was chancellor of a university, but he didn't want to have that happen again. And so he was laser focused on improving the campus in terms of a life safety goal, but then the entire steering committee and stakeholders from all sorts of different departments came together and really wanted to broaden the study to look at resilience holistically. So the idea of understanding what the risks were to the continuity of campus services and teaching and research. And so basically that was the launching point for, you know, we're 5 years in right now. And excited that it's moving along. I would say one other thing is that at the end of the day, I know one of our clients at UBC will say that it comes back down to the cost benefit as well. And that was really something that resonated with them, that actually there is a demonstrated cost benefit, especially in designing new buildings to higher standards. As John mentioned, it's a small fraction of the price, and the payback periods that we were calculating were on the order of like 5 to 10 years. So that was worth it. And then on the retrofit side, while it doesn't always pay back, if you're going to make the decision to retrofit, then there is an incremental small cost. We're going through pilot studies right now to get it to beyond the life safety objective as well.
That's great. Okay, so some of the things that I hear there is like really having an institutional champion that has like ideally experience, but then also like at least fluency in the issue, being able to express the cost benefit environment in terms of use and function. So the primary functions of the organization there. And I guess what I meant by like, especially UBC, is that like, it's massive. Its own, like it's probably bigger than like some Bay Area cities, and even the Bay Area being highly populated, you know, on a regular basis. So it seems like a huge, huge lift. But yeah, so that's really interesting.
I can jump in quickly and add something, Micah. Sorry, I'm not able to turn on my video. It's Jessica. Just to kind of build on that piece, I'd put in the chat quite early on to Ibbi in reference to Ibbi's work at UBC. I really think it's obviously quite, you know, a showcase piece of work and an awesome project. But I think it is still important to note, like you're saying, Ibbi, that it builds off essentially decades of risk assessment and risk analysis. But it seems to take some kind of institutional champion to really push that to the next level. And so my actual question would be, that work at UBC campus, what do you see the ways essentially that it could be scaled up to a more citywide or regional scale? Like Mike is saying, it's already a fairly large campus and a compact campus.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with UBC and like I will say the framework that we've come up with is a draft, and we still need to get buy-in and feedback on that. But the framework, I think, is applicable to, you know, other other cities and campuses. I would say also we're trying to create something that's achievable over time, and feasible from a cost perspective as well, but incrementally progressing over those 30 years, and really focusing on where investment will pay back the most. So I think that makes sense for any jurisdiction like a city. I mean, the difference maybe between a city and UBC is that the city owns some assets, but largely, by and large, they're not owned by the city. And that might be more difficult, but you could also create certain, zoning or certain code requirements for different zoning. That's possible, but that's going to take a generation, to recycle out the older, more vulnerable buildings and replace them with newer, more resilient buildings. And then there's also the utility infrastructure. So UBC kind of controls that on their campus as well. So I would say it would definitely be harder in the context of the city. Also in terms of money, where's the money coming from? That's not as easy. But I certainly think there's parts of the framework that we've developed that can be used and applied to other networks. I've actually spoken to Angie about this quite a bit as well, where I think it lends itself really well to something like a healthcare network. And if I know UBC, I think they'll end up publishing this and posting this publicly at some point in the next several months.
Yeah, I was also trying to make the connection with our session earlier today for organizations like TransLink, like these organizations that are essentially asset managers.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of crossover. And just finally, quickly, I think we'll probably jump over to Carlos's question about the existing hospitals next. Seems to be the most upvoted question, but just quickly, the two pieces up front in the UBC work, and I think Murray might also have a comment or reflection on this as well, are the fact that those two essentially objectives were set, life safety, and I don't know how you'd phrase the next one. It basically is something like functional recovery. How important have those two upfront pieces? They're essentially the vision or objectives. How important have they been to driving this work?
Jessica, you're referring to Ibbi's first slide, right?
Yeah, Ibbi's slides in terms of the objectives that framed that UBC effort. The life safety, we know we need to address life safety, but concurrently think about an additional objective as well.
While we're waiting for him, I'm going to jump in and just give a thumbs up to that slide, because what you saw there, it did, is it set out a goal in terms of time. Not we're going to design for low drift, not we're going to design for low damage, but 3 months. And it said, this is our goal. And now we have to figure out as engineers how to get to that. But it understood the nature of the objective in terms of time.
And I also really like the time-based approach too, for like kind of connecting two of Jessica's questions. How could we apply this to the municipal scale, which, as you point out, is fundamentally different than the asset management scale? Different concerns, different levels of control, et cetera. But I like that time-based approach and setting that to kind of move off of David's definition of resilience, thinking about that in terms of the entire community and what little pieces of the community can we use to get to that. There's the assets of the city, there's the community resilience aspects, there's the infrastructure piece, which you pointed out as well. There's, existing buildings and new buildings, zoning as a way to get to new buildings. So I think that it's interesting. Like, there are different ways that it weaves in and ways that it doesn't weave in, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the life safety goal is kind of the prerequisite, I would say, for resilience, and even for the code, right? But we know that trying to achieve that target of no fatalities, especially for an area that has a lot of vulnerable buildings, is going to be challenging. But so in terms of the framework that we've developed, it really is to first address those buildings, the ones that would pose the highest life safety risks. At the same time, we'd like to bring the rest of the building stock up to this kind of more resilient standard. So the opportunities to do that is when you're retrofitting these higher risk older buildings, but also when you're replacing older buildings with new buildings. And so the downtime objective really drives, the decision making, I would say, for when to retrofit, what standard to retrofit to, and also for new construction, what level of performance are you trying to target? And so if you think about it, because a good proportion of the building stock on campus already exists, it was built to older codes, you're kind of locked in to pretty significant downtime under 475 year shaking. We've looked at other levels as well. And so my colleague, Mike Mueller, I think he's on the phone, did this piece of work to really understand what is the current downtime. And if we started to follow through the real estate framework in different scenarios, how long would it take to close the gap? And what is the best way to close the gap? Is it to focus on new buildings, to focus on existing buildings, which types? And so that's where we came up with this strategy. And again, I can't go into detail, unfortunately, but I think you will be able to see it eventually. We've been able to kind of isolate or identify which buildings are important, critical, or normal to support the resilience objectives. And this is an interesting piece as well. So if the resilience objectives is 3 months, what our work is showing is that we need about 90%, maybe a little bit less, of housing to be occupiable. Students, we don't want students to leave campus. That's a huge goal. We need a certain amount of teaching space, especially the large classrooms, to be available, because if you don't have large classrooms, then you're basically splitting up the core courses, and then what, you have to put them in temporary facilities. Not easy. And then there's the critical research pieces as well. We're trying to preserve the assets there. So all of that framework is set up to hit that downtime objective. And again, it has to be achievable within UBC's kind of traditional construction growth and rates. So yeah, it's been a really interesting project to pull all the pieces in and provide something that guides those decisions.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump in and ask one more question before we move to the open questions from the participants. Okay, and this is for all the panelists, all 4 of the panelists. We hear that there is a sweet spot between government regulation driving market transformation and potentially stifling innovation when it comes to achieving higher performance levels. Do you have experience that you could share in relation to suggestions regarding this sweet spot?
I don't think there is one. If there's a sweet spot, I would think of it more as kind of a bitter, narrowing, zero size. There's no sweet spot. They don't want to do it. They won't do it until it is demonstrated to them that it is contrary to the existing policy not to do it. Call me a curmudgeon, but I don't think of it as, no one's trying to balance here the appropriate level of benefit cost and say, aha, this is what we can do. Rather, at least in the States and particularly in California, the policymakers are waiting for people to come to them and demonstrate that they have an issue. And the best way to do that is to show them that the stick is going to hit them if they don't take advantage of the opportunity to go for the carrot. But I don't think there's nothing that magically works because it happens to be a benefit cost ratio of 2.4 as opposed to 1.3. I'm not seeing that.
As a public sector organization, we are driven by government policy and regulations. Our bandwidth or latitude for innovating is actually fairly limited. Having said that, there are ways for us to encourage and stimulate innovation. So I spoke earlier about, developing performance requirements for, through the planning and design process, developing performance requirements for our buildings and health campuses and really beyond to our communities that look out to 60 years, 80 years, and 100 years. So those performance requirements could look like, in this long-term care facility, there will be maximum 8% of days in a year that exceed thermal comfort thresholds, or maximum 2% days per year that exceed indoor air quality thresholds, and leave it at that. And within this and many other limitations and constraints, then we invite our design teams to innovate. A second way that we can encourage innovation is through what we call, I mentioned before, project procurement. So there's one instrument in particular called a scored element, whereby we invite bidders to go above and beyond our specified requirements. So for example, we may specify that this particular building needs to be extreme heat resilient to 2050. That's the requirement. The incentive is if you can demonstrate to us that it is extreme heat resilient to 2080 or even 2100, then we will give you these number of bonus points that are valued at this number, this many millions off of your submission. So those are a couple of the instruments that we have on hand. I think as we go forward, we will discover ways to tweak them and to develop new ones that will help to stimulate innovation.
John, I want to hear from you. we haven't heard from you since the last question. What do you think about this sweet spot matter?
No, again, it's a challenge for new buildings. Again, the code, I think on one hand it can offer things by making it easy to get a new bar. The code has provisions to be innovative today. With isolation and energy dissipation, there's opportunity to be innovative to get higher performance. And again, we've done work with the local municipalities where they've really been supportive of innovative design outside the code. They've been very supportive of that to achieve, whether it's life safety or occupancy or functionality, and they've been very supportive of innovative design. So I've had nothing but, we've had nothing but good success with municipalities to support that for new buildings. And again, I think the construction industry sometimes is reluctant, and I know they want to really be part of the solution to help us, build more of these projects to find that sweet spot. Gosh, I wish we could have more pilot projects, more demonstration projects to actually show, and have real data on the incremental costs, because that seems to be the fear all the time. We can do studies and show an incremental cost, but it would be nice to have more studies, more real pilot projects, confidence in the by the building officials and the construction industry and the public. And again, I think once that ball gets rolling, we'll get closer to some sort of sweet spot.
Great. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to jump over to Carlos's question about hospitals. That was our top voted question. Okay. So this is to Angie and John, but to, I think, everybody as well. The commentary of the 2015 NBC, National Building Code of Canada, acknowledges that designing hospitals as post-disaster facilities does not guarantee that these hospitals will remain functional following a major design level earthquake. The bulk of our existing hospitals were built a decade ago, so it should be no surprise if these facilities do not achieve post-earthquake functionality after a major event, right? How can we tackle this important issue? It seems to me that it seems to Carlos that the problem is not just technical, but the lack of mechanisms that trigger renewal of critical buildings, which I think really goes to your point, Angie, from before. Yeah, you would like your thoughts on that. So, the earthquake functionality issue, the older facilities for the hospitals, the problem that we have there. How can we move on that?
This is a very tricky question. Thank you, Carlos. The reality is that our operational budgets are very, very small. In fact, when we initiated our climate resilience and adaptation program 5 years ago, we started with our existing building stock. Of course, we want to fix problems before, so that we can understand how to not create new ones. But and so what we did was assess the climate resilience of 5 hospitals in the Lower Mainland, and developed a list of specific actions, and actually went to the extent of estimating the cost of addressing the gaps and weaknesses that we highlighted, and there was no money. So I point to climate risks, but this extends to seismic risk as well. And so what we do have to address seismic risk is we do have a very, very small side budget, and we focus mostly on non-structural elements. And that's where we're at with that. We register our risks in a database called a risk register. This is a very common tool. We also, and this is reviewed periodically throughout the year. We also, every 5 yearly, are required to carry out a facilities condition assessment on our facilities. So we're aware of what are the problems. And because we, over time, we simply ended up with a longer and longer list of problems, with our existing stock, we pivoted to new construction and major redevelopments. And herein lie the opportunities, because we have been able to build into the to capital budgets the work that we need to do. So John spoke earlier about pilot projects and studies and so on. This is actually how we pay for them. One set of pilot projects that we've been lucky to be part of is led by BC Housing's research center, and Wilma Lung in particular. John is very much a part of this initiative, and it was, and it continues to be, a mechanism of learning and innovation for us in terms of understanding, again, where are the opportunities in our process. So going back to the question of mechanisms to trigger renewals of critical buildings, what we have is we now have a means to understand the problem to the extent that we can act on it. So in terms of those deeper technical studies and the pilot projects that I mentioned, we also have, over the last year and a half, begun developing a network of allies, for a lack of a better term, in the design and construction industry that can help us to problem solve through the new construction and major redevelopment planning and design process. As we move forward and we effectively collect what we call resilient design strategies, we are identifying those that we can, and those performance objectives that we can translate to our existing stock. So we always have our existing stock and other facility archetypes in back of mind, but we can only do a certain number of things at once. So the last thing I wanted to mention is the tool that I mentioned earlier that we're only just beginning to understand how to use, which is the XDI platform. So looking not only at individual assets within a portfolio, but the portfolio at large, and where are the opportunities within that portfolio to share the burden of responsibility and cost for ensuring that our critical infrastructure has levels of functional recovery that we need it to have. With that, John, after you, I'd also like to ask Ibbi to, if you wouldn't mind sharing your approach or more information about the mechanisms to trigger renewals of critical buildings that's built into the framework that you've developed for UBC.
Okay, so yeah, so just two quick responses to Carlos' question. One is, yes, you know, if someone in the public, you have no time to read the commentary that says it may not be functional. So that's why, you know, in the 2020 code, we're going to say that the structure of a new hospital for 1 in 1,000 earthquake will be undamaged. So we're trying to get rid of that. So that's not going to contribute to the problems, and it will be very easily repairable for the 2475. So I think, you know, the old code, I agree, you know, it was hidden in the commentary, and, you know, neither the health community or the public knew that. So we've moved the bar on that for new hospitals. For existing hospitals, yeah, I agree, it's expensive to retrofit them. I would really hope the government would step up. I mean, we're spending more than $2 billion upgrading all our schools, and that's a fabulous effort. But, again, hospitals are critical infrastructure, and, wouldn't it be great if some funding was allocated on an annual basis to start upgrading, the critical hospitals as well, now that the schools are almost taken care of.
Did you want to add anything, Ibbi, before I move to the last question we're going to have time for, unfortunately?
Yeah. Angie asked about the UBC framework and how it addresses this. There's actually hospitals on UBC's campus. We're doing some assessments there. Again, the immediate or the urgent kind of need is to mitigate the buildings that have or pose the largest life safety risks. So that's where it starts. But then those that don't pose the largest life safety risks that are critical, the requirements to start to retrofit those come online probably in the next 5 or 10 years. And again, that is that's draft, right? That's what our recommendation is. That we haven't discussed that with UBC.
Great. Okay. So we're running low on time, so I'm going to do like a combo here of like last insights from the panelists, but I want you to think specifically about a question that we received, which thinks about funding and how we can make these sort of things cost effective and think about that kind of environment on it. So really, like, how do we get to this functional recovery standard, but thinking in terms of sort of like cost effectiveness and making projects work? I'll start with David and then we'll go around for just a couple minutes because I need to leave 5 minutes at the end for Murray.
We're showing already that they're cost effective. So I think, again, to go back to the sweet spot question or the funding question, yes, it's easy to think that there might be some solution that if we just found it, everybody would do it. That's not the way it works. If that were true, we'd have everybody doing it. Well, what I think is the better way or the more accurate way to look at this is that there are leaders and there are followers. Leaders, I'm talking about jurisdictions, clients and developers, engineers. They're already doing this stuff and they are showing us proof of concept that it can be cost effective. The project delivery system that Angie described has actually been used in the University of California, San Francisco. Same thing. They put out the RFP. Here's our minimum, do the best you can. This is our budget. We're not going a penny over. And they got an outstanding building for 0% cost premium because they understood that that's what they wanted, how they wanted to do it. So you let the leaders lead, they're going to show us that proof of concept. I don't think it's about trying to find a pile of money first. Last point on this, I know we want to wrap up. If you go to a public official and with an idea or to show them that you have a problem and we have to solve it, and they ask you, okay, find me the funding for it, what they're telling you is they don't really care yet. So our job is to convince them that this is important enough for them to allocate some of the budget they already have.
How about you up next, John? Kind of final thoughts.
Yeah, no. I mean, I second David's comments. Again, my talk has been sort of focused mostly on codes, and I think the codes, it really can provide an important role in functional, in functional recovery and in resilience. And again, as I say, it levels the playing field for everybody. The cost increment, as we've shown, is small. The cost increment to Canada-wide, to construction-wise, is small. Again, if we can get people to support these incremental increases in code requirements to make a uniform playing field incrementally every 5-year cycle, I think that's one key aspect to get us there for new buildings.
How about you, Ibbi?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what David said, by and large. I mean, I think we have to start somewhere, and there's already people doing, the beyond code or resilience-based design. And I think this is going to take a generation's worth of effort, really. And hopefully in 30 to 50 years, we'll have cities that have a lot more resilient building stock.
How about you, Angie?
2 things. Understanding clearly what's the cost of an action. And not just in terms of our assets and infrastructure, but our ability to provide services out in the community and beyond our sphere of control and even beyond our sphere of influence. And so that includes community health and human health. So quantifying that and conveying the cost to our broader society of inaction, I think, is extremely important. And secondly is to redefine ourselves. What is our business as usual, and reset our baseline. So in collaboration with all the regional health authorities in BC, intrepid professional services firms and public sector organizations, including BC Housing and UBC, we're working to do just that. Strength in numbers.
So what we've tried to do here with the panel today is really think through this functional recovery standard, think about what the code gives us and how we can kind of move past that, the cost benefit environment of it, what it means to do it at an institutional level, like with a large asset manager, what it could be for a large city, to kind of provide us here in BC with a sort of an imperative to think about this for our new buildings and to think about this as we reduce risk among our existing buildings and all buildings entirely towards a sort of vision of community resilience. So yeah, I'm gonna hand it over to Murray because apparently this ends at 2:30 when I thought it ended at 3. So here we go. Its own type of disaster, I guess. Thank you guys, from me personally, thank you guys so much for being on this panel and this conversation today. I know I will be watching the video afterwards for inspiration on my own work. So I really appreciate all of your thoughts. And thanks so much for everyone with the questions. I tried to rope them into the conversation as much as possible with the time that we had. So thank you so much for your questions and engagement and participating in this panel. So I'll hand it over to Murray.
Thank you, Micah, and thank you to our panelists for sharing your insights and experience around this topic. I feel like this region is obviously we're behind where other parts of the world are in this, but we have some unique opportunities here, and your thoughts and insights on how we might take some of your experience and apply it here in BC is really very much appreciated. The URBC organizing committee was looking for a way to give back from what we're doing here, and in lieu of speaker gifts, we are offering a contribution to a program called Preparing Our Home. This is to support Indigenous youth and building their capacity to become leaders in this field. And so we're excited to contribute to that on behalf of this community. This has been really a turning point for us, this particular conversation around functional recovery. It's so fundamental to what we're hoping to do here in this region. And we have 2 more sessions coming up that I hope will build on the concepts laid down here today. We have 2 sessions in October and a whole nother program coming up in November. Later on this in October, we have a session that will attempt to use some of the information that we have to measure where we are and kind of get at these questions of functional recovery. At least it's a step in that direction, and we hope you'll join us and provide some feedback to that work. And we're also going to be hosting a conversation later in October about the issue that David started us off with. It's not about buildings alone. It's about the governance. It's about the systems that we have in place. And so we're going to spend some time focusing on what we need to do to really get to that end goal of resilience. And so please do join us for these sessions coming up. And with that, on behalf of our panelists, on behalf of Micah, who did a great job moderating and posting questions and keeping the conversation going, I'd like to thank you all for participating in the webinar today. We will, as we have been for every one of these sessions, we're collecting all of the content. We had 2 note takers here today with us who were making notes and recording all of this. So we'll share that back to everyone who participated. So look for that on the website coming up, and we'll try and let you know by email as well. With that, I want to wish everybody a great rest of this day. I know up here in BC, we're enjoying some really clear, beautiful weather right now, and I hope for you all down in California that things are going to ease off a little bit here with the forest fires and other things. But thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And on behalf of URBC, have a great day, and we'll see you down the road.